All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about cause and effect to get started for the reason that we are interested in differentiating between correlation and causation. So studies that are doing mostly correlation are describing things or relationships that are already present in the world. Experiments or experimental methods are looking at manipulation of one or more independent variables to test relationships that are in existence in the world. So again, a correlational study is looking at things that are already happening, right? Sometimes we are looking at correlations because we can't influence the factors that we think are predictive, such as gender, such as age, right? But other times we can influence things, so we manipulate them, and that's when we do experiment. So the first reason to start here is the old adage, I'm sure you guys have heard it before, correlation does not imply causation. Great example here. The lady is reading the news to her husband, and she says, this new study found that Colorado has the lowest obesity levels of any state. You know what that means, honey? And he says, no, what? She said, forget dieting, we're moving to Colorado. As if being in Colorado would make you have the lower obesity rates, because there are fewer people in Colorado who are obese. Correlation, not causation. In this particular instance, there could be, and maybe are, were it true that there were lower obesity rates in Colorado, a lot of other third variables that matter for explaining that relationship. So it may be the case that lots of folks who enjoy outdoor sports live in Colorado. Colorado has some great skiing. Colorado has great mountain bike trails, lots of hiking in Colorado. So it may be that folks who enjoy physical activities live in Colorado, in which case it's not really Colorado, it's physical activities. But since the things are all correlated, right, the enjoying physical activities goes with Colorado. So we're kind of missing the middleman there, right? And that's an example of a third variable. So in the third variable problem is essentially that, where you're missing an explaining factor. You're missing a confound. One of the examples of a third variable problem is that the murder rates in major cities are often correlated with ice cream sales. So, murder rates and ice cream sales. Is it because ice cream is somehow making folks want to kill each other, right? Death by vanilla ice cream cone. No, that's not what's going on. It is that people tend to be outdoors and in public and in situations where they may have confrontations more often in warmer months. And in warmer months, we also eat more ice cream. So there's a third variable, which is warmer months. And even warmer months is not even really the thing, right? There's warmer months, and then warmer months meaning people that are outside and interacting in different ways. So there's a couple different variables in between that are making that make sense. It's not about the ice cream, right? Okay, so with an experimental design, you are comparing two or more conditions to assess whether one independent variable or one predictor variable is leading to changes in an outcome variable or a dependent variable. So experimental designs are the only time we can make causal statements. This caused this, and that's because we can manipulate the independent variable and control for anything else that might be a third variable. So you want to have the experience of all participants be exactly equivalent except their exposure to the IV. So you're controlling everything, so the independent variable is the only thing that changes. If this sounds difficult, I'm saying only and control a lot, it is. That's why we are so careful in social science and psychology in particular with talking about cause. Because it is so hard to systematically control for all the other things that could matter to a relationship that we're interested in. And without doing that, we can't say that the independent variable causes changes and the dependent variable, which is the goal for an experimental design. So one of the key things for experimental design is randomization of participants. So this ensures that any third variables that might come up with whom you're asking to participate are randomly kind of distributed across the population. So if it is the case that folks who really like country music do better on this one quiz, I'm going to pick folks at random from a population such that I'm going to get a random amount of folks that like country western music, right? So if there's some demographic or pre-existing factor that is going to predict our dependent variable, we want it to be randomly distributed throughout the sample. We want it to be randomly distributed because of the fact that if there's systematic effects, right, if I were to choose all men as participants on something where gender might matter, then I can't tell whether it's the independent variable that caused changes in the dependent variable or gender, right? If I find that there's a relationship between shoe size and intelligence, but I only study men, maybe that's different in women. Maybe there's something else going on that I can't tell because I can't disentangle shoe size and intelligence. So the goal is to control everything through this randomization so that only the independent variable influences the results. Okay. So one way of doing this is between subjects design. So this is one independent variable. This is the simplest way to do the experiment, where you have an independent variable with two levels, so an experimental condition and a control condition, and one outcome variable. So some people get to eat the ice cream before hanging out at the park, and some people don't. And then you see if they get into a fight when they're in the park. If we're testing if ice cream's related to murder, that is. So another example, if I'm interested in film viewing and aggression across kids, I would look at some kids having seen the film, other kids not having seen the film, and then look at aggression. So as a matter of fact, let's look closer at that particular research question. So our hypothesis here would be that children who watch the violent film are more aggressive than those who don't watch the violent film. So variables here, whether they watch the film or not. And the second one would be aggression. Aggression is a hard one because you'd have to figure out how to operationalize aggression. So aggression on a game, whether they choose to cheat or act in ways that are not in the best interest of other folks on a game, whether they hit their sister in the next 2 hours, lots of different ways of operationalizing aggression. In this case, the IV is the violent film, the independent variable is the violent film, the DV is aggression. So we would randomly select kids to be either in the experimental group where they see the violent film, or the control group where they don't see a film. And we would look at aggression and compare across the two groups. If we had done our randomization correctly, we might be able to argue that the violent film, in this case Power Rangers, was what created or what caused the aggression that we saw in that group, but not in the other group. So the random assignment in this case, each kid would have equal opportunities to be both in the experimental group or the control group. This ensures that both of the groups are equal or comparable at the start. This last example that I just gave you of watching a movie versus not watching a movie, was a pretty bad example. So this is a non-equivalent control group. Sometimes we have that as the unavoidable case when there's nothing that we could give that would be similar to the experimental condition. In this case, if we think that the Power Rangers is a violent film and we have some kids watch the Power Rangers movie, we might have another film that we don't think is violence, or some other nonviolent activity for the other kids to do, because otherwise it might be that they are aggressive because they were just sitting watching a film and so they have a lot of anxious energy and the other kids were running around. Or they, I don't know, the kids who didn't watch the violent film were out there running around and kicking and playing and were more likely to have time to get into arguments when the kids who were watching the movie didn't, right? So it's not really comparable because the activity that both of those groups were doing was not really comparable. Okay, so some disadvantages of experiments. Experiments tend to be artificial. So part of the issue with controlling everything is that the world is messy. You guys know this. So find an example where the only case that kids are exposed to aggression is that one movie, right? What's the likelihood? How do you take away or ignore other past images or modeling that they might have had about aggressive behaviors that could interact with the movie that they saw, right? So controlling everything makes it hard to generalize what you find to real life because of the fact that real life by its nature is messy. So the next would be ethical concerns. There are some things that we cannot study. It would be lovely to fully understand how abuse affects kids, kids' cognition, right? I'd love to better understand that. Well, we have to be real careful with looking at experiments because ultimately, if I'm going to control everything, then I am either putting a kid into a situation where they're likely to get abused, or I am not allowing for certain interventions to happen because that would make them different than right. So you get into some really tough ethical issues if you're wanting to isolate particularly risk factors, like we tend to in psych, like we're mostly interested in clinical psych. In order to look at that in a truly experimental setting would be unethical in a lot of cases. One of the ways that we handle that is if we have an intervention that we think could work, we will put people in the intervention and then other people on a wait list. And then afterwards, once we are convinced that the intervention mattered or helped people, we give everyone the intervention. There's a lot of variables that we really want to know about, but we can't randomize. All right, and that's the end of this video.